The door to the Cooper farmhouse flew open so hard it cracked against the interior wall, and Edith Cooper did not flinch. She stood at the kitchen table, flour dusting her forearms, a rolling pin in her hand, and she looked at David Whitaker the way a woman looks at a man she has already decided she does not trust. He stood in her doorway with his father's arrogance written in the set of his jaw, a crease in his vest that spoke of money, and an offer folded in his breast pocket that he had not yet shown her, but which she already knew she was going to refuse. "You have until I count to 3, she said, her voice steady as the San Pedro River in January, "to tell me what you want, and then you are going to leave my land." David Whitaker had ridden 40 miles from his father's Whitaker ranch to stand in this woman's doorway. He had expected tears. He had expected desperation. His father, Gerald Whitaker, had told him that the Cooper widow was broke, that her land was worth more than she knew, and that the drought of 1882 had broken her the way it had broken every small rancher in the Arizona territory. His father had said she would sign anything. What his father had not told him was that Edith Cooper had eyes like hammered bronze, a spine made of iron ore, and absolutely no intention of selling the 200 acres that had cost her more than money could measure. "My name is David Whitaker," he said, and he watched her jaw tight. She already knew who he was. Of course she did. In Benson, Arizona territory in the summer of 1882, everyone knew the Whitaker name and what it meant. It meant power. It meant the cattle empire that Gerald Whitaker had built on the bones of smaller men's dreams. "I know exactly who you are," Edith said. She set the rolling pin down slowly, deliberately, because the deliberateness was its own kind of message. "You are the man who has come to finish what your father started." That was the moment David Whitaker felt the first crack appear in the certainty he had ridden 40 miles to deliver. He had expected a grieving widow. He had not expected a woman who could name his purpose before he opened his mouth. He stepped inside without being invited because his father had raised him to take space as a matter of right, and immediately he understood that this was a mistake. The way Edith Cooper's gaze sharpened at that single uninvited step told him volumes about her that his father had failed to report. "You were not invited in," she said. He stepped back over the threshold. He stood on her porch. The summer heat of southern Arizona pressed down on him like a physical weight, and a hawk circled somewhere above the dry grass hills, and David Whitaker, 27 years old, educated at a college in Philadelphia, heir to the largest cattle operation in Cochise County, stood outside a woman's door because she had not invited him in. He could not explain, even to himself, why that felt correct. "My apologies," he said. She stared at him. Then she stepped aside and gestured once for him to enter. To understand how David Whitaker came to stand on Edith Cooper's porch with an offer he had not written, and she had already decided to refuse, you had to go back 3 years, to the summer of 1879, when James Cooper had first driven a wagon onto this piece of land, and told his wife that this was where they were going to build something that would last. James Cooper had been a good man, the kind of good that does not announce itself. He had filed the homestead claim properly, had spent 2 years proving up the land the way the Homestead Act required, had built a house with his own hands and planted alfalfa in the creek bottom, and run 40 head of cattle on the high pasture. He had been Edith's husband for 6 years, and she had loved him with the practical, deep love of a woman who had chosen well. Then in the winter of 1881, James Cooper had ridden out to check his cattle in a sudden norther and had not come back. They had found him 3 days later, frozen, half a mile from the house, his horse having thrown him on a patch of ice near the creek crossing. He had been 31 years old. Edith had been 26. Gerald Whitaker had sent a condolence letter that arrived exactly 4 days after the funeral. The letter had contained a cash offer for the Cooper land. It had been insulting in its timing and nearly as insulting in its amount, being roughly a third of what the property was worth. Edith had used the letter to start a fire. She had spent the following 18 months doing what James had done, holding the land together by force of will and physical labor, and the occasional help of her neighbor, old Magnus Reyes, who ran sheep 2 ridges to the east and who had his own quiet war with the Whitaker operation. The drought of 1882 had complicated everything. The creek ran thin. The alfalfa burned. She had sold 20 of her remaining cattle and had taken a loan from the Benson Merchant Bank to cover the water rights assessment, and the banknote was due in 90 days. Gerald Whitaker sat on the board of the Benson Merchant Bank. This fact was not a coincidence. So David Whitaker had come with an offer. That was the setup. That was the trap his father had built over 18 months of patient financial pressure. And now David sat across from Edith at her kitchen table, holding a cup of coffee she had poured because politeness was its own kind of armor, and he spread the offer document between them on the table like a man playing cards he was confident about. She did not look at the document. She looked at him. "How old are you?" she asked. He blinked. 27. "Your father sent you because he thought a younger face would make this easier," she said. It was not a question. David's mouth opened and then closed again. He picked up his coffee and took a sip and bought himself a moment to think, because the woman across from him was doing something he had not experienced before, which was reading him accurately and saying what she read aloud. He had been in business dealings in Philadelphia and in Tucson and in Tombstone. He had negotiated cattle prices and water rights disputes and range agreements. Nobody had talked to him the way Edith Cooper was talking to him. "My father sent me," he said, choosing honesty with some surprise, as though he found it in his pocket and did not remember putting it there, "because he believed you would be more receptive." "More receptive to what exactly?" "To signing over my land for a price that is 40% below the assessed value." She finally looked at the document, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone reading something they have already read many times in their mind. "Your father has been trying to acquire this parcel since before my husband died. The bank note is his doing." The timing of this offer, 90 days before that note comes due, is not an accident. The silence that fell was significant. David set his coffee cup down and looked at the document and then looked at the woman across from him, and the thing he felt was not the businesslike certainty he had arrived with. What he felt, rising from somewhere beneath his father's instructions and his own polished self-assurance, was something uncomfortable and clean, the way shame feels when it is new. "Mrs. Cooper," he said. "Do not," she said quietly, "use that tone with me. I am not a problem to be managed." "No," he said, "you are not." He looked around the kitchen. He looked at the careful mending on the curtains, the way she had stretched the calico until it fit the window exactly. He looked at the cast iron stove, which was old but kept with a kind of fierce maintenance that spoke of someone who owned things intentionally. He looked at the garden he had seen through the window when he rode up, which was thriving despite the drought because she had dug a secondary channel from the creek and lined it with flat stones to reduce evaporation. He had noticed that when he rode up and had recognized it as the work of someone who understood land and water and was not going to give up either without a significant fight. "I will not sign this," she said. "Whatever your father believes about my circumstances, and I imagine he believes quite a lot, I am not signing this today, or any day." David folded the document and put it back in his pocket. He should have stood up. He should have said he was sorry to have troubled her and ridden back to his father's ranch and reported that the Cooper woman had refused, at which point his father would have escalated pressure through the bank and through whatever other mechanisms he had in place, and the whole miserable business would have proceeded according to Gerald Whitaker's plan. That was what David should have done. What he did instead was say, "How did you run the channel from the creek to the garden?" Edith stared at him. Whatever she had expected from this conversation, it had not been that. "What?" "The stone-lined channel. I saw it from the road. It is a clever solution to the evaporation problem. I have been trying to work out a similar system for the south pasture on our operation, and the engineer I hired from Tucson gave me a proposal that would cost $2,000 and take 3 months to implement. You appear to have done something comparable for what, perhaps $20 in labor and materials. $12, she said, very slowly, and 4 days of my own work. How did you calculate the slope? She looked at him for a long moment as though assessing whether this was some new angle of manipulation she had not anticipated. Then something in her made a decision. She stood up and said, "Come outside." He followed her out the back door and around the garden to where the channel began at the creek bank. It was a small masterwork of practical engineering. She had cut the channel at a precise angle, not too steep that water would run too fast and not slow enough to allow stagnation. And the flat stones she had laid as the channel floor were fitted together with an instinctive precision that a surveyor would have approved. She explained it without pride or false modesty, simply and accurately, and David listened with genuine attention that surprised them both. He asked 3 follow-up questions. She answered all 3. By the end of the 3rd answer, they were standing side by side looking at the creek, and the afternoon light was doing something extraordinary to the dry grass hills across the valley, turning them a color that was almost gold. And a roadrunner moved along the far bank in that quick, purposeful way that roadrunners had, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "Your father is going to call in that bank note," David said finally. "I am aware. He has done it before. To the Harmon place and to the Castillo family before that. He waits for the note to come due and declines to extend the terms and the property transfers to the bank and then to him." Edith turned to look at him, and her expression was careful and measuring. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because it is true and you deserve to know what you are facing." He paused. "What I am part of, whether I agreed to be or not." The afternoon was very quiet. A quail called from somewhere in the dry brush. The creek made its thin sound over the stones. "I have 90 days, she said. "The note is $420. I have 60 of it. I need the rest." "That is not insurmountable." "It is when the man who controls the bank is the same man who wants your land." David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I would like to come back, not with another offer, without an offer." Edith Cooper looked at him with those bronze eyes and said, "What would be the purpose of that?" "I am not entirely certain yet," he said honestly. "But I think I need to understand something about this situation that I have not understood." She did not say yes. She did not say no. She turned and walked back toward her house, and when she reached the back door she paused without turning around and said, "Magnus Reyes runs sheep 2 ridges east. He does not trust your family. If you come back, you come alone, and you come without that document." Then she went inside, and the door did not close hard this time. It closed with a quiet deliberateness that felt, to David Whitaker, very much like a conditional invitation. He rode back to his father's ranch with the offer unsigned, and a feeling in his chest that he had not ridden there with. Gerald Whitaker was 56 years old, and had built his empire through a combination of genuine capability and a moral flexibility that he had never troubled to examine. He was a large man who had been physically powerful in his youth and was now powerful in other ways, the kind of powerful that comes from owning things and knowing that ownership is its own kind of argument. He met David in the entry of the main house and looked at his son's face and said, "She refused." "She refused," David confirmed. Gerald made a sound through his nose that was not quite contempt and not quite surprise. "I expected as much for the first visit. You will go back." "I intend to," David said, and if Gerald heard something different in that statement than what he put there himself, he did not show it. David went back 4 days later. He had thought about it in the intervening days more than he had thought about anything in recent memory. He had thought about the stone channel and the carefully mended curtains, and the way Edith Cooper had explained the slope calculation with the precision of someone who had taught herself engineering from first principles because there was nobody else to ask. He had thought about the look in her eyes when she named his father's plan aloud, the fearlessness of a woman who had already lost the most important thing, and had therefore calculated that there was not much left that she was afraid of. He had thought about her voice, which was clear and direct and carried no performance in it whatsoever. He arrived at the Cooper place on a Tuesday morning in early July. The sky was the deep blue that the Arizona Territory managed before the heat of the day built up, and the hills had that clean, sharp-edged look that came with the early light. He left his horse at the post and did not call out because he did not want to seem presumptuous. He waited. Edith appeared from behind the barn leading a cow. She saw him. She said nothing for a moment, then said, "There is coffee on the stove, help yourself." He went in and poured his own coffee, which was the first time in his adult life he had poured his own coffee in someone else's kitchen. His father's house had a cook and a housemaid and a hired hand who served at table. He stood in Edith Cooper's kitchen and poured his own coffee and drank it looking out the window at the dry hills, and by the time she came inside, he had refilled the cup and found a second cup and poured her one as well. She stopped when she saw the second cup. Something moved across her face quickly, a small thing, and then it was gone. "Thank you," she said. They sat at the table. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, which surprised him because he had expected awkwardness and found instead a kind of settled quality, the way rooms feel when they have been lived in honestly. "Tell me about the bank note," he said. "The original terms, not just the amount." She looked at him steadily. "You could read those terms at the bank." "I could, but I would like to hear them from you because you understand your situation better than a document does." She studied him for another moment. Then she told him. The note was 3 years old, taken out after James died to cover the land assessment and the first year of operating costs alone. The interest rate was 9%, which was high but not extraordinary for 1879 Arizona. The original banker had been a man named Potts who had been decent and who had given her favorable extension terms twice. Then Potts had retired and the bank had reorganized under new management, and the new management was influenced very directly by David Whitaker, and the last extension request had been denied with a letter that was polite in its language and absolute in its refusal. $420 in 90 days, David said, with the interest added $452. And you have 60. I have 63. I sold a calf last week. He nodded slowly. He was doing arithmetic in his head, not the way a banker does arithmetic, but the way a man does who is trying to find a path that he can feel good about walking. He said, "Your alfalfa field. If the creek holds, what is the yield?" "Enough to cut 3 times this season if the rains come in August the way they sometimes do. I have a standing buyer in Tucson who pays $8 a ton." "How many tons per cut?" 4 if the yield is good, 3 in a drought year. He did more arithmetic. The numbers were close but not enough, not in 90 days, and both of them knew it. But he was not looking at this the way his father looked at it, as a problem that resolved in David Whitaker's favor. He was looking at it as a problem that belonged to the woman across the table and that therefore, for reasons he was still sorting through, mattered to him. "There is a hay buyer in Tombstone who pays $10 a ton for guaranteed quality alfalfa," he said. "His name is Fletcher. He supplies the mining operations. They need fodder for the draft animals and he is always undersupplied. I know him." Edith looked at him. "Your family's operation does not sell to him." "No. We run cattle, not alfalfa." A pause. "I could write you a letter of introduction." "Why would you do that?" This was the question he had been asking himself for 4 days. He met her eyes and said, "Because what my father is doing to you is wrong. And because I rode out here carrying his machinery and I sat at your table under false pretenses and I would like to be useful in a different way." The quiet in the kitchen stretched. Outside, the cow lowed once from the barn. The hawk that seemed to live above this property circled in the blue window of sky above the kitchen window. "A letter of introduction," she said carefully, "is not the same as a solution." "No. But it might be part of one." She looked at the table for a moment, and he could see her thinking with her whole body, the stillness of someone who processes information physically before she speaks it. Then she said, "Magnus Reyes needs a letter of credit to expand his flock. The sheep merchant in Tucson will not extend terms without a reference from someone of established credit. If Magnus can expand his flock, he plans to share the water rights cost from the creek survey, which would reduce my assessment by $60. David said, I can provide a letter of credit reference for Mr. Reyes. Edith looked up sharply. Your father will not like that. Magnus Reyes is on your father's list of people he would prefer to pressure out of the valley. My father's preferences, David said, with a quiet clarity that seemed to surprise even himself, are not my law. The thing that happened in Edith Cooper's face at that moment was not a smile exactly, but it was in the neighborhood of one. It was the expression of a woman who has been given a piece of information that she is filing carefully away, not trusting it fully yet, but recognizing that it has value. Come back Thursday, she said. I will have thought about this more, and bring nothing from your father. He came back Thursday without a single document from David Whitaker. He came with a letter of introduction for Fletcher, the hay buyer, which he had written himself on his own paper with his own signature, and which made no mention of the Whitaker ranch operation. He came with a letter of credit reference for Magnus Reyes that was equally carefully worded and accurate, and which represented David's personal assessment of Reyes as a solid ranching operation, which was the truth. He had met Magnus Reyes once at a cattle auction and remembered him as a straightforward and hardworking man. Edith met him outside that Thursday morning, and he handed her the letters, and she read them both in the full sunlight, with the focus of someone who understood that documents had weight. When she finished, she folded them with the same deliberateness with which she did everything and looked at him with an expression that had more complexity in it than any expression he had seen in a long time. These will help, she said. I hope so. Why are you doing this? She asked again, not because she had forgotten the answer he had given before, but because she was testing it, checking to see if the same answer came back twice. In her experience, liars gave different answers on different days. Honest people repeated themselves. Because it is right, he said. And because you deserve a fair chance at your own land without being maneuvered into a corner by my father's financial engineering. He paused. And because I have ridden out here twice now, and each time I have found that the conversation is the most interesting one I have had in recent memory. She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was doing that extraordinary thing again to the dry grass hills. A hot, clean wind came from the south. You should know, she said, that I am not interested in any offer that comes attached to the Whitaker name or the Whitaker operation. Not now, not in 90 days, not ever. I understand that. And you should know that I am watching for hidden motives. I have been managed and maneuvered for 18 months by your father, and I have developed a sensitivity to it. That sensitivity seems accurate and reasonable, he said. I would not ask you to discard it. What would you ask? He thought about it honestly. The chance to be useful without it being a trap, the chance to come back. She looked at him for what felt like a very long time. Then she said, Thursday after next. I am going to see Fletcher in Tombstone next week with the letter. When I come back, I will know whether it worked. I will be here Thursday after next, he said, and he left. He drove to see Magnus Reyes on his way back to his father's ranch. Reyes was a compact, weathered man of about 50, with an Andalusian grandfather and a Sonoran grandmother, and the particular quality of stillness that people develop when they have survived many kinds of pressure without folding. He met David at his gate with a look that was exactly what Edith had described, the look of a man who did not trust the Whitaker name. David handed him the letter of credit reference without preamble and explained what it was and why he had written it. Magnus Reyes read it twice, slowly, and then looked up at David with an expression that was not quite suspicion anymore, but was not trust either. It was something in between, the careful state of a man who is weighing new information against old experience. Your father does not know you are here, Reyes said. It was not a question. No. What does this cost me? Nothing. It is a letter. Use it or don't. Men like your father do not give things away. I am not my father, David said. I am still working out what that means, but I am not him. Magnus studied him for another long moment. Then he nodded, once, the way men nod when they have made a provisional judgment and are prepared to update it if the evidence warrants. He folded the letter into his shirt pocket and said, "You should know that I have a shotgun inside the house, and that if I ever discover this is a trick to get information about my operation, I will use it." "Understood," David said. "The widow Cooper is a good woman," Magnus added. "The best neighbor I have had in 30 years of this valley." "She seems to be," David said, and he rode away feeling that something had been established that he could not fully name. The 2 weeks before the next Thursday had a peculiar texture. David carried out his normal work on his father's operation, which was substantial and demanding, overseeing the movement of cattle from the summer pasture, and negotiating with a buyer from Albuquerque, and dealing with the daily machinery of a large ranch. But at the same time, he was aware of a parallel track running in his mind, a running assessment of every decision his father made that touched on the Cooper parcel, or on Magnus Ray's, or on the bank. And what he found there, when he looked at it honestly, was a systematic and deliberate pressure campaign that had been years in the making, and that was uglier the closer he examined it. His father had bought influence with the bank. His father had timed his offers to coincide with the moments of maximum vulnerability. His father had calculated that a grieving widow alone on a drought-year homestead with a bank note coming due was a problem that resolved itself if you waited long enough and applied the right amount of financial pressure. David had known in a general way that his father operated this way. He had not examined it up close before, and examining it up close while knowing Edith Cooper's name and the details of her stone-lined irrigation channel, and the way she had set down the rolling pin with quiet deliberateness when he came to her door uninvited, well, it changed the nature of the knowledge. It made it personal in a way that general knowledge never was. He began, quietly and without announcing it, to make inquiries. He had a lawyer friend in Tucson named Harlan Briggs who knew territorial land law. He sent Briggs a letter asking about the specific provisions for banknote extensions under Arizona territorial statute, particularly regarding any obligations the bank might have when a note holder was in demonstrated hardship. Briggs wrote back with 3 pages of dense legal argument, the upshot of which was that the bank's refusal to extend was technically legal, but that there were provisions for filing a complaint with the Territorial Land Office that could delay proceedings and create significant administrative inconvenience for the bank. This information he carried to the Cooper place on the Thursday after next. Edith was already working in the garden when he arrived, in the early morning cool. She was weeding with a focused energy that he had come to recognize as her default mode, an attack on whatever task was in front of her that was both efficient and total. She did not stop working when he rode up, which he appreciated. "How was Tombstone?" he asked, dismounting. "Fletcher took 12 tons at $10, she said, pulling a weed with precise violence. "Guaranteed delivery in September." He did the arithmetic. $120. Plus the 63 I have, plus what the Ray's arrangement frees up. She stood and pushed a strand of dark hair back from her forehead. Her face was dusty and she did not care, which was characteristic. "I am still short, but it is closer than I was." He told her about Briggs and the Territorial Land Statute. He explained the complaint provision carefully, because it mattered that she understand the mechanism rather than just the outcome. She listened with the full-body stillness that was her listening mode and asked 2 precise and intelligent questions at the end that showed she had absorbed every word. "You need to file the complaint immediately," he said, "before the note comes due. It delays the bank's ability to proceed and creates a time window. And you believe this lawyer Briggs is reliable?" "I have known him for 6 years. He is honest and competent." She thought about this. Then she said, "Come inside, I want to show you something." He followed her in, and she went to a cedar chest in the corner of the main room and opened it, and removed a folder of papers. She set them on the table and he leaned over them, and they were the original homestead claim filing, and the survey documents and the water rights assessment, and the original bank note terms, and every piece of paper that related to the Cooper property. She had kept them in perfect order, each one dated and labeled in a clear, spare handwriting. "I want to know if there is anything in here that changes the legal picture," she said. "Anything Briggs should know." He looked through the papers carefully. He was not a lawyer, but he had handled enough business documents to read them with precision, and what he found in the middle of the stack stopped him. He read the page twice to be sure he had understood it. "This water rights assignment," he said. "What about it?" "This was signed by the previous owner of the Whitaker operation, my father's predecessor, a man named Alton Cross." He looked up at her. "This assigns shared water rights to whoever holds the Cooper parcel in perpetuity. My father's acquisition of the Cross operation should have transferred this obligation to him." Edith leaned over the table. Meaning that my father already has a legal obligation to share the creek water costs with you, and has apparently been ignoring that obligation for 2 years." The silence was absolute. "That is worth money," she said finally. "It is worth a legal claim that might well be worth considerably more than $452. She looked at him and he looked at her, and something passed between them at that moment that was not yet named, but which had the quality of something that had already decided to exist and was merely waiting for the people involved to catch up with it. "I need to get this to Briggs," she said. "I can take it to Tucson tomorrow." "You would do that?" "Yes." "You understand that if this water rights claim is valid, it is a legal action against your father's operation?" "Yes," he said. "I understand that." She held his gaze for a moment with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable, the intensity of someone looking for the hidden motive and finding, with some confusion, that it was not present. Then she said, "Take it." He rode to Tucson the next day with the water rights document, and 2 days later had a reply from Briggs that was unambiguous. The obligation was legally binding. The Whitaker operation owed 2 years of shared water rights costs to the Cooper property, which amounted to approximately $340. Combined with the territorial land statute complaint, this gave Edith Cooper a legal position that was considerably more solid than her father had calculated for. David rode back to the Cooper place with Briggs's written assessment and laid it on the kitchen table and watched Edith read it. Her hands were very still on the paper, and her face was controlled, but her eyes were doing something complicated, and he recognized it as the expression of someone who has been carrying a very heavy weight for a very long time and has just been told that a portion of it is going to be lifted. "This could save the property," she said. "I believe it will." She looked at him. "David," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name. The word hit him somewhere in the chest. He was aware of being hit there. He was aware, in a way he had not been before, that the distance across the kitchen table was not very large. "What you have done," she said carefully, "is give me the means to fight your own father. You understand what that means for you when he finds out?" "I have been thinking about that," he admitted. "What did you decide?" "That it is the right thing to do. And that whatever happens with my father is a consequence I am prepared to accept." She stood up from the table and walked to the window and looked out at the dry hills for a long moment. When she turned back, her expression had something new in it, something that was not quite the guarded assessment she had been maintaining since he first appeared in her doorway. It was softer than that and considerably more honest, and it was the expression of a woman who has decided, against her better caution, to believe something. "You are not what I expected," she said. "I know," he said. "I was not what I expected either." She laughed. It was a short, surprised laugh, genuine and unguarded, and it changed the room entirely. He had not expected that laugh, and it undid something in his chest that had been tightly held, some formal restraint that had seemed necessary and now seemed merely in the way. "Sit down," she said. "I am going to make supper and you are going to tell me about Philadelphia." He sat down. He told her about Philadelphia. Then he asked her about where she had grown up, which was a small town in Ohio where her father had been a school teacher. And she told him about learning mathematics from her father, and how it had given her the ability to teach herself almost any practical calculation from first principles, which was how she had worked out the irrigation channel without a surveyor. She told him about meeting James at a church social and knowing within 2 conversations that he was the man she was going to marry. And she said this without grief, but with a clean-edged acknowledgement that was more honest than any performance of sorrow would have been. He told her about his mother, who had died when he was 12, and who had been a gentle woman overwhelmed by his father's force of personality. He told her that he had spent 3 years in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania studying business and law because his father had required it, and that the most useful thing he had learned there was not business or law, but the ability to read a room and the people in it, which was a skill that had not fully engaged until he sat across from her at this table. She put a plate of beef and beans and corn bread in front of him, and he ate it, and it was the best meal he had eaten since he could clearly remember, which he said, and which she received not with false modesty, but with a simple nod that said she knew it was good because she had made it. The sun went down over the hills while they talked, and the kitchen got dark, and she lit the oil lamp and they kept talking. And at some point, David Whitaker understood that what was happening at this table had nothing to do with land or banknotes or water rights. It had to do with him and with her, and with the particular gravity that exists between 2 people who have found in each other something they had not known they were looking for. He left late, later than he should have, and rode back to his father's ranch under a moon that was large and serious over the desert hills, and he knew with the certainty of someone who has stopped arguing with himself that he was in love with Edith Cooper. Gerald Whitaker found out about the water rights claim on a Wednesday morning 2 weeks before the bank note came due. He found out because his lawyer in Tombstone received a formal notice from Harlan Briggs in Tucson, indicating that the Cooper property was asserting its claim under the 1876 water rights assignment and requesting an accounting of the shared costs obligation for the previous 2 years. Gerald came to David's room at the ranch house at 6 in the morning and stood in the doorway, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has been operating a machine that has just developed an unexpected and significant malfunction. "You," Gerald said, "went to her with information." David sat up in his bunk. He had been awake already because some part of him had been waiting for this. "Yes," he said. "You found that document in her papers and you took it to your lawyer friend." "Yes. You understand that this legal claim is going to cost me $340 in back payments and create an obligation going forward." "Yes, I understand that." "I sent you to buy that land," Gerald said, "not to arm her against me." "I know what you sent me to do," David said. He was dressed and standing now, and the 2 men faced each other across the room in the early morning light. Gerald Whitaker was still a physically large man and still carried a density of will that could fill a room. But David had grown up in that density and had learned its shape exactly, and he was no longer afraid of it. "What possessed you?" Gerald demanded. "The knowledge of what was right," David said, "which I have been arriving at slowly and which you have not significantly helped with." The anger in Gerald's face was a complex thing. It had different layers to it. There was the businessman's anger, which was the anger of someone whose carefully laid plan has been disrupted. Beneath that was the father's anger, which was the anger of someone who expected an instrument of his will and found instead a man with his own ideas. And beneath that, David suspected, was something that was not quite anger at all, something that was closer to recognition. The complicated recognition of a man who sees in his son a quality that he had in himself once and abandoned. "You are in love with her," Gerald said. David had not expected his father to arrive at that conclusion so quickly or to say it so flatly. He was silent for a moment and then he said, "I am." Gerald looked at him for a long time. The ranch was waking up outside, the sounds of horses and the hired hands beginning the morning work, the ordinary sounds of a large operation starting its day. Gerald's face moved through several expressions, none of them pleasant, and then settled into something that was simply old, the face of a man who is measuring what he has built against what it may have cost him. "She will not forgive me," Gerald said finally. And it was remarkable, the flatness of it, the accurate acknowledgement. "Not quickly," David agreed. "Possibly not for some time, possibly not completely. And you are going to pursue this?" "Yes." Another long pause. Gerald looked out the window at the hills. "Your mother would have liked her," he said, "from what you've described." David was quiet with that for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, she would have." Gerald left without another word. The confrontation David had expected, something loud and ultimatum-shaped, had not arrived. What had arrived instead was something more complicated, and in some ways harder. The sight of a man who had done wrong things, recognizing the cost of them, without being fully prepared to stop. The legal process moved quickly once Briggs filed the complaint and the water rights assertion. The bank, faced with an administrative delay and a collateral legal challenge that complicated the note proceedings, chose to extend the terms by 60 days rather than engage in what promised to be an expensive and publicly embarrassing legal fight. The water rights back payment arrived from Gerald's lawyer, somewhat sourly, in the amount of $340, delivered to Briggs's Tucson office in banknotes. With that payment plus the Fletcher Hay contract advance and the shared water rights assessment reduction from Magnus Reyes's arrangement, Edith had, on a Thursday morning in late August, exactly enough to pay off the bank note with $4 to spare. She paid it in person at the Benson Merchant Bank, which she had always intended to do because she was the kind of woman for whom the personal transaction mattered. She wore her best dress, which was a deep green wool that she normally saved for church, and she carried the bank note and the payment in a leather folder that had been her husband's, and she laid the money on the counter of the bank manager's desk, and she watched him count it. And when the receipt was in her hand, she folded it into the leather folder with the same deliberateness with which she did everything important. And she walked out of the Benson Merchant Bank into the bright September sunlight of 1882, and she stood there for a moment, breathing. David was waiting by the horses at the post in front of the bank. She had not asked him to come, but she had told him the morning she was going, and he had come. He was holding his hat in both hands, which was a posture she had come to recognize as his version of being uncertain, and when he saw her face he read it accurately, and something in his expression opened with relief. "Done?" he asked. "Done," she said. "Paid in full. The note is discharged." He put his hat back on and smiled, and it was the genuine smile of a man who is happy for someone else's victory, uncomplicated by self-interest. She had been watching for self-interest for weeks now and had not found it, which was its own kind of education. They rode back toward the Cooper place together, side by side, on the dry road that wound through the desert scrub with the mountains blue and serene in the distance and the high clear sky above them. The September heat was just beginning to ease as the season shifted, and the air had a first suggestion of autumn in it. A faint coolness in the morning that would build over the coming weeks into genuine cold. "What will you do now?" he asked. She knew he meant more than the farm. He meant the next phase of her life, the shape of the future that had just opened up with the discharge of the bank note. "The same as before," she said, "but without the threat of losing it. That is not nothing." "No," she agreed, "it is everything." They rode in comfortable silence for a while. The horses moved steadily on the road. A jackrabbit launched itself across the road ahead of them and disappeared into the brush, and a hawk, possibly the same hawk that always seemed to circle above the Cooper land, tilted on a thermal above the hills. "Edith," he said. She looked at him. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to ask it plainly without ceremony because I think you prefer plain to ceremonious." "I do," she said. "I would like to court you properly. With your permission and with full transparency about my intentions, which are honorable and which I hope over time will be apparent to you." She held his gaze. The road wound between two hills in the valley opened up ahead of them. the Cooper place visible a quarter-mile away, the garden and the barn and the small house with its curtained windows, and the channel she had built running green with the creek water through the garden. "You came to my door with your father's offer," she said, "and you left with more than you arrived with. You left knowing that what you were asked to do was wrong, and then you came back. Yes, that took something. Some of it was you," he said honestly. "You made it impossible to stay comfortable in what I had been told to do." She smiled then, a real smile, the second one he had ever seen from her, and it was different from the first, wider and more settled and aimed directly at him. "You have a great deal of ground to make up," she said. "Your family name carries weight in this valley that is not entirely pleasant. I know, and I will be watching for hidden motives for quite some time. I expect nothing else. And Magnus Reyes will also be watching, and he told me explicitly that he is prepared to be unpleasant if necessary. I met Magnus, I believe him." She laughed again, that clear, surprised laugh. "Then yes," she said. "You may court me properly." He rode home to his father's ranch that evening with the sensation of someone who has crossed a line, and is entirely certain they are on the right side of it. The courtship of Edith Cooper by David Whitaker in the fall and winter of 1882 was a thing of some local interest and considerable local opinion. Benson was not a large town, and the Cooper place and the Whitaker operation were both well-known quantities in the valley, and the sight of Gerald Whitaker's son riding regularly to the widow Cooper's homestead provoked a range of interpretations from the charitable to the deeply suspicious. Magnus Reyes watched from 2 ridges east with the patient surveillance of a man who had invested something in the outcome and intended to be satisfied with the results. What the observers saw, though they understood only some of it, was 2 people learning each other with the thoroughness that comes from both of them being, at core, honest people who were not interested in pretense. David came on Tuesdays and Thursdays and occasionally on Saturdays when the ranch work permitted, and he worked when he came, which Edith had established as a condition of his visits early and to which he had agreed without objection. He fixed the barn door that had been sticking since spring. He helped with the second alfalfa cutting and threw bales with a genuine physical commitment that surprised her because she had expected the soft hands of a wealthy man's son, and found instead that he had spent enough of his youth on the ranch to know how to work. He relaid 3 sections of the stone channel, where the winter cold was beginning to push the stones out of alignment, and he did it without being asked, having noticed the problem on his way in one Tuesday morning. She cooked supper on Tuesday evenings, and they ate at the kitchen table and talked for hours. The conversations ranged widely, and with a freedom that grew as the weeks passed, covering the territorial politics that were reshaping Arizona, and the rights disputes between the mining operations and the small ranchers, and the ongoing injustice of the Apache removal, about which Edith had strong and carefully reasoned views, and which David found that he shared once he had examined his own positions, honestly rather than simply inheriting his father's opinions wholesale. She told him about her father's schoolroom and about the books she had read growing up and about her ambition, which had been to be a schoolteacher herself until James Cooper had taken her west, and she acknowledged without bitterness that the West had given her other things, things she had not anticipated but which she had come to value. She told him about the first winter on the homestead, which had been severe and difficult beyond anything she had imagined, and about how she had survived it by deciding that she was not the kind of person who did not survive things. He told her about the loneliness of his father's house after his mother died, which he had never told anyone because there had been nobody to tell, his father having a practical man's impatience with grief, and his schoolmates at the Tucson Academy having been largely unreachable. He told her that the years at the University of Pennsylvania had been intellectually rich and personally empty in a way he had not understood until he had sat at this kitchen table and found the combination of both in the same place. She listened to all of it with the full attention she gave everything, and she held it carefully, and she did not offer false comfort or easy analysis, which he had learned was one of her most important qualities. She responded to what he said as though it were real and important because she believed it was, and the experience of being taken seriously in that complete and unsentimental way was something he had not known he was hungry for. They walked together on October evenings when the light turned the desert into something that looked like a painting of itself, the saguaros going dark against the orange sky, and the air cooling fast with the altitude and the season. He reached for her hand on one of those walks tentatively, and she let him take it, and they walked in silence for a long time with their hands fitted together, and it was, for both of them, enough. The first time he kissed her was in November, outside the barn on a cold, clear morning when she had been showing him the improvements she was planning for the cattle pen, and had turned to point at the far corner and had found him very close and had looked at his face, and the sentence she had been saying simply stopped. He kissed her gently and briefly and with the full seriousness of a man who understands that a kiss is not a casual thing, and she kissed him back with the straightforward honesty that was characteristic of her in everything. She pulled back after a moment and looked at him with those bronze eyes and said, "We should be clear about where this is going." "Yes," he said, "I'm not interested in anything that is not permanent." "Neither am I," he said. "I want to marry you, Edith. I have wanted it since October, and I am saying it plainly now because you prefer plain." She looked at him for a moment in the cold morning air, with the breath coming white between them and the hills behind her, brown and gold with the late-season grass. Then she said, "I am going to need until spring." "Spring," he said, "to be certain." "That is fair," he said. "I will wait until spring." He waited until spring. It was not a passive wait. Every Tuesday and Thursday he came, and every Saturday he could manage. And through the winter they deepened their knowledge of each other with the thoroughness of two people who have decided that knowing someone is a project worth the full commitment of their attention. They disagreed on things and worked the disagreements through with a directness that sometimes startled both of them, the way that honesty can be startling when you are not accustomed to it being mutual. They agreed on more things than they disagreed on, which was also its own kind of revelation. David Whitaker had pulled back from his pressure campaign. The combination of the territorial complaint and the water rights legal action had cost him money and reputation, and the legal obligations going forward required him to maintain the shared water costs with the Cooper property, which he did, with no great warmth but with the accuracy of a man who understood when a position was no longer tenable. He and David had several more direct conversations over the winter that were difficult in the way that conversations between men who have been redefining their relationship are always difficult, full of old habits on one side and new boundaries on the other, and the absence of easy resolution, but also, gradually and unexpectedly, the first tentative movements towards something that might in time become a different kind of understanding. Gerald came to the Cooper place once in February. Edith received him at the door with the same steadiness with which she received everything, and he took off his hat and spoke with a plainness that seemed to cost him something significant, acknowledging the wrongness of the pressure campaign, the bank manipulation, the timed offers. He did not minimize or deflect. He said what he had done and acknowledged it was wrong and said he was sorry, and the apology was imperfect but real in the way that apologies are when they come from people who are not practiced at them. Edith listened and received it and said, carefully, that she appreciated his honesty and that she intended to hold the water rights obligation to its full terms going forward, and that she would see what time brought. It was not forgiveness, but it was a door left ajar, and it was, from a woman who had every reason to slam it shut, a considerable and considered grace. In March, Magnus Ray's flock expanded by 30 sheep on the strength of the credit reference David had provided, and Magnus came to the Cooper place to tell Edith, in front of David, that he was revising his position. He said it in the way Magnus said most things, with economy and precision, looking at David for a moment with the assessment of a man updating a calculation, and then saying, simply, "He will do." He went back to his sheep operation, and David and Edith stood on the porch looking at his departing figure, and David said, "I believe that was an endorsement," and Edith said, "From Magnus, that is a formal declaration of support," and they both laughed, standing on the porch in the March wind with the mountains sharp and white-tipped against the blue sky. In April, the desert bloomed. The late rains of March had come in exactly as the meteorological patterns of southern Arizona sometimes permitted, a generous soaking that had settled the dust and coaxed the Palo Verde into a gold-green explosion of color and the Ocotillo into brilliant red, and the whole landscape into a brief, extravagant display of what it could be when the conditions were favorable. On a Saturday in mid-April, with the hills full of color and the creek running strong, and the alfalfa in the bottom field showing strong green growth, David rode to the Cooper place and tied his horse and found Edith in the garden, her hands in the soil, her hair loose in the spring warmth, and she looked up at him when he came through the gate, and her expression was the expression of someone who has made a decision and is at peace with it. She stood up and brushed her hands together and said, "It is spring." "It is," he said. "I have been certain since January," she said. "I was giving myself until spring because I thought I needed the time to be cautious, but I knew in January." "What did you know?" he asked, though he knew. "That I love you," she said, with the directness that was entirely her. "That I want to marry you. That you are a good man who is still learning the shape of who he is, which I respect, and that I would like to learn it with you." He crossed the garden in 3 steps, and she was in his arms, and he was holding her, and she was holding him back with the same strength, the same commitment, the same absolute honesty with which she did everything. The April wind moved through the garden, and the hawks circled above the hills, and the creek ran strong over its stones and Magnus raises. Sheep made their sound on the far ridge, and the whole valley went about its ordinary business in the way that beautiful days do, indifferent to the pivotal moments happening within them. They were married in Benson on a Saturday in June of 1883 at the Methodist church that Edith attended, by the Reverend Hollies, who had known Edith since she arrived in the valley, and who performed the ceremony with a warm simplicity that suited both of them. Magnus Reyes came and stood in the front pew and nodded at the right moments with the gravity of an elder delivering a verdict. Harlan Briggs came down from Tucson and was best man because there was nobody else David was more indebted to or more genuinely fond of. Gerald Whitaker came and sat in the back and was very quiet, and when the ceremony was finished, he came forward and shook his son's hand and looked at his new daughter-in-law with an expression that was several things at once, regret and respect, and something that might, given years and evidence and the patient work of restitution, become something warmer. Edith gave him her hand and said she hoped the coming years would give them reason to find common ground, and it was the most generous thing she could have said, and Gerald Whitaker appeared to understand that. They held the reception at the Cooper place, which was Edith's insistence because the Cooper place was where this story had begun and where it was continuing, and it seemed right. Magnus brought mutton and something he made from dried peppers and cornmeal that nobody could identify, but everyone consumed with enthusiasm. Briggs brought 2 bottles of good bourbon from Tucson. The neighbors from up the valley came, and the family from a ranch to the north, and the sheriff and his wife from Benson, and the schoolteacher and her husband, and the whole gathering had the quality of a community reassembling itself after a long disruption, finding that its pieces still fit when given the opportunity. David moved to the Cooper place because Edith had the land and the water rights and the established operation, and because it made logical sense, and because neither of them had any patience for arrangements that made less sense simply for the sake of appearances. They expanded the cattle from 20 head to 35 in the first year, using careful financial management and the hay income from the Fletcher contract, and a judicious small loan from a bank in Tucson, not Benson, taken under terms that were entirely fair. David brought organizational skills that complemented Edith's practical instincts and engineering ingenuity, and she brought a knowledge of the land and the water and the seasons of the valley that no amount of business education could have given him. And together, they built something that was considerably more than either of them had alone. The water rights dispute with the Whitaker operation settled into a functioning arrangement that was not warm, but was functional. The payments made on schedule. The shared resource managed with the careful impersonality of people who have agreed to be decent to each other in specific defined ways, while the larger question of trust was worked out over time. Gerald Whitaker, it turned out, had the capacity for acknowledgement of wrong, if not always for the easy repair of its consequences. And over the months and years that followed, he moved, slowly and unevenly but genuinely, toward a position that was less adversarial. He helped with a fence repair after a bad storm without being asked, and this was noted. He sent word when a mountain lion was spotted near the south pasture, information that was practically useful, and this was also noted. The ledger of small decent acts was being built, deposit by deposit, and Edith kept it accurately because that was who she was, and she acknowledged each deposit without pretending it balanced the earlier debits. In the spring of 1884, their first child was born, a boy they named James after Edith's first husband, and with David's full agreement and understanding of what that name meant and why it was right. James David Whitaker arrived in March with the desert blooming around the small house and the creek running strong and the alfalfa just breaking green in the bottom field. And Magnus Reyes brought something he had cooked and stood at the door with it, looking at the baby with the expression of a man who has been granted an unexpected continuity of something he valued. And he said, "Good," with the economy that was his characteristic, and that was that. Gerald Whitaker came to see the baby and held him with an awkwardness that was simultaneously the awkwardness of a man not accustomed to infants and the deeper awkwardness of a man holding the consequence of his own transformation, the grandchild he had nearly prevented by being the man he had been, the child who existed partly because his son had looked at a water rights document and made a different choice than Gerald would have made. He looked at the baby for a long time, and when he handed him back to Edith, he said, quietly, "He has your eyes." And Edith looked at the baby and said, "I hope he has your son's conscience." And the two of them looked at each other over the head of the baby with a complicated and genuine understanding that was not forgiveness in its full form, but was something that pointed in that direction. The house expanded in 1885. A new room added to the east side to accommodate the growth of the family and the organization of the operation, built with lumber from the mill in Tucson, and with the help of Magnus Reyes and two hired hands in Harlan Briggs, who came down for the raising weekend, and proved to be both more useful with a hammer than anyone had expected and considerably more willing to discuss the finer points of territorial water law over supper than anyone had bargained for. The evening of the raising, with the new room framed and roofed, and the smell of fresh lumber in the cooling air, they sat around the long table in the original kitchen, and the conversation went in 8 directions at once, and Edith looked around at the people at her table and felt the particular satisfaction of a woman who has built something deliberately and well, something that extends beyond the physical structures into the human relationships she had cultivated with as much care as any irrigation channel. In the fall of 1885, Gerald Whitaker had a health difficulty, a chest ailment that laid him up for 2 months, and that revealed, in the way that illness reveals things, that the Whitaker operations management had become increasingly dependent on David's involvement. Gerald had not acknowledged this in so many words, but it was evident in the way the operation ran more smoothly when David was available, and in the complicated relief on Gerald's face when David came to help oversee the fall cattle sale from his sickbed. David managed the sale and reported the results with the precision and completeness that his father required, and Gerald listened and approved every decision and said, at the end of it, "Your mother would have been proud of who you are." And the sentence arrived so unexpectedly and with such accuracy that David had to take a moment before he could respond. "She would have loved Edith," he said. "Yes," Gerald said. "I know she would." It was the closest they had come to a full accounting, and it was enough. Gerald recovered from the chest ailment but was slower after it, less relentless in his operations, as though the illness had adjusted something in him at the level of velocity. He began to spend time at the Cooper place on Sunday afternoons, which Edith had extended as an invitation on the understanding that it was conditional on continued good behavior, a phrase she used with a dry precision that made him laugh, the first time she had made him laugh, and which established a dynamic between them that had more ease in it than anything that had preceded it. He watched James crawl across the kitchen floor with the attention of a man trying to reckon with something irretrievable and something newly given at the same time. And he was, on those Sunday afternoons, quietly and adequately good. By 1886, the Cooper property, which Edith retained under her name because she had earned it, and because David supported this completely as a matter of both principle and practical sense, had expanded to 260 acres with the purchase of a neighboring parcel that had come available when the family that held it relocated north. The cattle herd was at 50 head, the alfalfa operation at full capacity with reliable buyers in both Tombstone and Tucson, and the creek water management had been formalized in a shared agreement with 3 other operations in the valley, a regional arrangement that was more equitable than anything the valley had managed before, and which Magnus Reyes had helped design with the methodical thoroughness that he brought to all important projects. In the spring of 1886, a second child came, a girl this time, with Edith's bronze eyes and David's quick reading of situations, and they named her Clara, which had been David's mother's name, and the naming of her was the last piece of something that had been building slowly, the establishment of a life that contained both of their histories, both of their losses, both of their origins, in a structure that was neither his nor hers but entirely theirs. There was a morning in June of 1886, 4 years after David Whitaker had first ridden to the Cooper place with his father's offer folded in his breast pocket, when he woke before dawn and lay in the bed beside his wife in the house that had been hers and was now theirs, and listened to the ordinary sounds of the morning beginning, the birds in the scrub oak outside the window, the distant sound of the creek over its stones, the first stirring of the cattle in the far pasture. He lay in the dark and took inventory of what had happened, which was his habit now on mornings when he had the quiet to do it. He had come with a trap and had walked into something entirely different. He had come with his father's motive and had discovered his own. He had come with an offer that was part of a long manipulation and had left, the first time and every time after, with an education in what it meant to be a good man in the way that Edith Cooper understood goodness, which was precisely and without decoration, and without expectation of credit. She had not set out to educate him. She had simply been herself with complete consistency, and that self had been the most instructive thing he had encountered. He had paid nothing for it, not in the way that the offer he had come with would have paid nothing, but in the way that you pay for the most important things by becoming someone who could receive them. He heard her wake beside him in the dark, the particular quality of her stillness changing to the stillness of someone present and awake. "You are thinking loudly," she said, her voice rough with sleep and warm with it. "I am taking inventory," he said. "What is the assessment?" He turned toward her in the dark and she turned toward him, and the familiarity of her presence was the most specific and extraordinary thing he knew. "Everything in surplus," he said. She made a sound that was part contentment and part amusement. "Good," she said. "Now go back to sleep. James is going to be up at first light and he is going to want to help with the morning feeding, and his version of help requires supervision." He laughed quietly. "He is going to be a rancher. He is 3 years old and has already tried to instruct Magnus on proper sheep management. Magnus was not receptive." "What did Magnus say?" "He said your father's son and seemed satisfied by this assessment." David smiled into the dark. "High praise from Magnus." "The highest," Edith agreed. She moved closer in the dark, and he put his arm around her, and she settled against him with the ease of someone who has found the place they belong and has stopped needing to be anywhere else. Outside, the Arizona morning was beginning its slow build from black to indigo to the first suggestion of gold on the eastern mountains, and the desert was making its small sounds, the birds and the insects and the wind and the creek. And in the room behind the house, little James was sleeping with his hands curled under his chin the way he did, and Clara was sleeping in the cradle by the window, and in the kitchen the stove was banked and waiting for morning. And 2 Ridges East Magnus Rays was very likely already awake, because he was that kind of man, checking his flock in the pre-dawn dark with his quiet, accurate attention. The rival's son had come with an offer, and had found himself outmatched not by argument or legal mechanism, but by something simpler and more complete. The example of a woman who knew exactly what she was and what she was worth and what she would and would not accept, and who had held that knowledge with such steadiness that it had realigned everything that came into contact with it, including David Whitaker, who had ridden 40 miles with his father's document and his father's assumptions, and had arrived home at this kitchen table and never entirely left. He had left with an education he had not paid for. He had paid for it since then, in the only currencies that meant anything, in changed behavior and honest labor, and the continuous work of being the man she had first believed he could be before he had fully believed it himself. He was paying for it still, every day in the best possible way, the way you pay for the things that are really yours. The morning light came over the mountains and moved across the valley and touched the Cooper place with the impartial generosity of the Arizona sun, which did not distinguish between the great and the small, but illuminated everything with the same fierce clarity. The day was beginning. There was work to do and children to feed and cattle to move and water to manage, and 100 ordinary tasks that were the texture of a life built properly. And Edith Cooper, who had kept her land and her name and herself intact through the worst that could be brought against her, rose to meet it with the same straight spine and clear eyes, and the addition, which she did not take for granted, of the man beside her who had come to take something, and had ended by giving everything that mattered. She put the coffee on. He came out of the bedroom and found the cup she had already poured for him, the way he had poured for her that first Thursday morning, and they stood together at the window looking out at the valley in the new light, the hills gold and the sky that impossible blue and the alfalfa field green and the cattle moving in the far pasture. And it was, as it had been every morning for 3 years now, the best morning he could account for. "Magnus is coming to dinner Sunday," she said. "What is the occasion?" "He wants to discuss expanding the water rights agreement to include the Henderson operation to the north." She sipped her coffee. "He has drawn up a proposal." "Of course he has." "It is very thorough." "Of course it is." Outside, they heard James's voice from his room, the particular early morning sound of a 3-year-old who has decided that the day has begun and that everyone else should agree. Then Clara added her voice to this, in the high clear register that babies use for announcements, and Edith set down her coffee cup and was already moving toward the door. "Go catch your son," she said, "before he tries to go help with the cattle unattended." "He would not get far," David said, already moving. "He would get further than you think," she said. "He has your determination and my navigation ability and Magnus's belief in his own judgment, and there is absolutely nothing he could not talk himself into attempting." David collected his son from the bedroom, lifting the small, warm weight of him with the ease of practice, and James said, "Papa, the cows," with urgent certainty, and David said, "We will get to them, we will get to them," and carried him to the kitchen where Edith was already at the stove and Clara was in her cradle watching the morning come through the window with the wide, unhurried attention of a baby who has not yet learned that there is anything to miss. The Cooper place was alive and well on that June morning in 1886. Every acre of it earned and kept and growing. The stone-lined irrigation channel running clean from the creek to the garden. The alfalfa field standing full and ready for the first summer cutting. The cattle herd healthy and well managed, and properly watered under the agreement that now protected the valley's small operations from the kind of predatory acquisition that had once nearly ended this particular story before it became what it was. And in the kitchen of that house, with its carefully mended curtains and its cast iron stove, and its table that had seen so many conversations that had changed the shape of two lives in a valley, breakfast was being made by a woman who had refused to be defeated, and was being helped by a man who had come to defeat her and had been educated into something entirely better. And the education was ongoing, the kind of education that does not end because the subject keeps expanding. And both of them were entirely prepared for that. James ate his breakfast and announced his intentions regarding the cattle with a specificity that suggested he had been planning since before dawn. Clara kicked her feet at the ceiling. The coffee was strong and good. The mountains held their distance and their permanence in the morning window. The hawks circled. The creek ran. The day began, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the right life in the right place with the right person, built from the wreckage of a manipulation that had failed into something that would stand, and had already stood, through drought and financial threat and the hard work of becoming honest with each other and with themselves, and which would continue to stand through whatever came next, because the foundation was real, and the builders knew what they were doing and loved what they were building. And that, in any territory and any century, is the whole of it.